Hello, thank you for joining us. This is Brave New History. I'm here with Pastor Dr. Chris Rodkey. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
And yeah, we're talking about Christianity and what's going on. So, um, let's see. So, yeah, what's your background and what are your degrees in and whatnot?
Sure. Very briefly, I'm from Central Pennsylvania, and I live in Central Pennsylvania. Um, I uh, I have a degree in philosophy and English from St. Vincent College, which is a Benedictine college outside of Pittsburgh, and I have a master's degree from the University of Chicago, a Master of Divinity, and a PhD in philosophy and religion at from Drew University. I wrote my dissertation on Paul Tillich and his influence on 20th century theology and philosophy. And I'm currently a United Church of Christ pastor in Dallastown, Pennsylvania. And I've been a longtime adjunct professor of philosophy at Penn State's York campus.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so maybe we'll just get into it. What are your thoughts on the origin of Christianity? It's any links to mystery cults and what was going on at the time?
Sure. Well, I'm speaking as a clergy person, so I'm not speaking as a sociologist or a objective historian. Um, and I'm also a theologian, and my background really isn't in Mediterranean history or anything like that. But um, after I went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 2014, which was sponsored by the Masonic Knights Templar of Pennsylvania. They send clergy on a all expenses paid pilgrimage as an educational trip. That really woke me up to modern biblical scholarship, and I've really dived deep into it since then. Um, and seeing the topography and understanding the geography of the land a lot better got me very interested in how this helps me understand the Bible and reading pretty seriously into the history of the first century. Um, so um, I'm not someone that thinks that mystery cults are a dominant way of thinking about Christianity in its origins, but it's undeniable that it's part of the cultural milieu of the time. There's no way around that. And as Christianity develops over centuries, the influence of what we would call mystery cult traditions is undeniable, and it's clearly there. But in terms of its origins, I think there are some cues here and there that this is in the mix. But we're also talking about a group of early Christians that were trying to figure out what it meant to be Christian. Uh, they did not have the word Christian. Um, they were part of a different kinds of Second Temple Judaisms of the era, and following the destruction of the temple, had to redefine itself for a variety of reasons that are sort of disputed, but did happen that they sort of separated from Judaism and expanded into um, evangelism into non-Jewish areas of the world, and that had happened before then, but became less and less Jewish. But as Christianity expanded into other parts of the world, it took along with it parts of those cultures, and that's really undeniable. And we see that as it unfolds. So the idea of having initiatory practices in Christianity that uh, seem to come from the John the Baptist movement um, it clearly has this tinge of a mystery cult to it. I don't think it's just that, but it is bringing in a sense of initiatory experiences that elevate one's spirituality or epistemology to be newly baptized into the world, for lack of a better word, uh, of interpreting things differently and seeing the world differently, and seeing Christ in the world newly. I don't think they meant that to be a mystery cult, but I think what they probably knew about mystery cults helped them develop what it became. And I don't think it was a big jump from where I think baptism came from as a ritual. I know I just
Yeah.
loaded a whole bunch of stuff there.
Yeah, no, that's good. And so when we look at the rituals like baptism, confirmation, communion, right, that it kind of feels like those are a little bit ritualistic, right? You know, like how would you respond to that and like the whole um with like revealing the mysteries in terms of the parallel with confirmation and its development in Christianity? What do you think about that?
Well, we know that the Eucharist was around from the very beginning. We have evidence of that. And the idea of confirmation is something that happens a lot later, historically, and is hotly debated. And it's a very interesting subject in and of itself. And that really didn't take a whole lot of shape as we understand it today until the Crusades. Um, and that's a long conversation of where that came from. But there was this sense that there needed to be a 3-step initiatory process. Um, before it was confirmation, what was necessary that might not have been a separate sacrament was chrismation. And in fact, some Christians still call confirmation chrismation, or the act that is the liturgical act that occurs in the sacrament of confirmation is a chrismation. That has some origins that go back about sealing one's baptism, right? And often done by a bishop and not by a local pastor. And to this day, Anglo-Catholics still require a bishop to perform a confirmation with the special chrism oils that are prepared and blessed specifically for this purpose. And I think every diocese in the world has a chrism mass every year where they distribute the oils and pledge loyalty to the priests. The diocesan priests are asked to pledge loyalty to the bishop in the use of these oils that then aren't used until the bishop comes, or a bishop comes to perform the sacrament of confirmation. And Orthodox churches do it differently, but there is a similar kind of chrismation, and some of the non-Roman Catholic churches do it a little differently too. So there is this sense of initiatory processes in Catholicism, at least with the 7 sacraments, and every sacrament is an initiation of some sort. That marriage is an initiation, ordination is an initiation, unction is an initiation, and reconciliation is an initiation, but it is reconciliation that is the sacrament that Catholics, as I understand Catholicism, are to be perpetually practicing. The others are just sort of preparation for the work of Christianity, which is reconciliation, which is why there's often this emphasis on confession and the rite of reconciliation as what keeps one on good standing to receive other sacraments or certain other sacraments. But yes, if you're baptized a Catholic, you are entitled to a Catholic funeral, but you're not entitled necessarily to a confirmation or a wedding as a sacrament, right? There's the different initiatory experiences give different privileges along the way, and there's also an expectation that very few people receive all of them. A priest will probably not experience the sacrament of marriage unless he's performing it. Interestingly, Catholic deacons would be the exception. The sort of second-class clergy have the ability to experience all the sacraments in many cases. So, and I think in Protestantism, we've lost this sense of initiation outside of the baptism ritual, but it is initiatory. Um, the idea of a believer's baptism in evangelicalism is a kind of initiatory experience, but it is often self-defined, and that I have clergy colleagues who are evangelicals who will, the first thing they ask a pastor when they meet them is, "So when were you born again?" Or "Are you born again?" Um, for many Christians, that the way that is being asked or what they mean by that doesn't have much meaning or doesn't make much sense. But for many evangelicals, that's all that matters. And I've had some interesting, deep conversations with clergy about biblical criticism and biblical interpretation. And pretty much what it comes down to is that there is sort of this ideological um, heteronomy, I guess is the right word, that is that one ascribes to if you are born again. So there is this sort of ideological assumption that comes along with being born again. Um, I don't want to say that that means, well, you're a card carrying Republican now, um, but it usually ascribes certain kinds of political gestures that if you're not with me on these issues, you're not really born again. What shows me that you're born again is whether we agree politically or not, and if we can agree on how we proof text the Bible for those politics. Now, clearly, I'm not in that camp, and I don't mean it to sound too polemic, but there is this. But to answer your question, there is this sense of initiation that is very much there, and this sense of regularity or regulation in terms of one telling the other whether it's legitimate or not. So initiatory rituals are all around us in contemporary 21st century Christianity. I don't think a lot of churches think of it in those terms. But as someone who is in my oldest son is going through a confirmation class right now, and luckily I'm not the one teaching it, but I've taught confirmation class many times for dozens and dozens of kids, and I really want to emphasize to people that this is an initiation in one way or the other. You might define it as something differently, and I think it's meaningful if teenagers sort of find a way of understanding that this is something that I can define for myself, but that's not a way out of it meaning something. That's a way of making it mean something. I've also been an advocate in my tradition for confirmation as a repeatable ritual. We don't, in the United Church of Christ and most Protestants, don't think of confirmation as a sacrament, but and many Protestants really reject the idea of confirmation, but it is a repeatable ritual that is something that could be done over and over again, of sort of signifying adult learning and different depth of learning, and sort of going through the basics again to have a deeper understanding. And I've done many adult confirmation classes. In fact, I think there's a few people I've actually confirmed more than once, going through it myself, or going with me through it.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, for sure. With the whole Chisholm thing, I've heard that there's, and maybe this is kind of outside your purview, that they associate the Chisholm with baptism of fire in some of the Nag Hammadi texts. Have you heard anything about that? Now it's related to fire?
Yeah, I can't say I know of a necessary historical connection between those. Um, I believe the emergence of this as something necessary in Roman Catholicism, at least, um, is had to do with the Cathar heresy. I'm reaching back into my mind a little bit here. The Cathar heresy, where there were priests that were sort of inventing new rituals that required one to renounce the horror of the church as close to death as possible, because there was this belief that the church had poisoned the faith. Um, and these priests were sort of systemically removed and executed to get rid of the idea. But that's what resulted in this policing of the oils. Um, the oil anointing process, I think, has its origins in the ways in which the early church developed their consecration of bishops. But I can't speak to the liturgical history of it beyond that.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts about the historical Christ?
Yeah. So what I think you mean by the historical Christ, there's the question of who is the Jesus of history, and then there's the question of the historical Jesus scholarship. Um, the historical Jesus scholarship is a product of the 1970s and 1980s that I think has value. It doesn't speak for me, but it has value and is an important part of the history of biblical criticism now. But the bigger question is, who is Christ of history? And I think it's important when I read the Bible, when I preach the Bible, to think about what the first century was like. What was the cultural milieu of the time? I had a seminary professor whose first lecture in the introduction of Bible class in seminary used this word, and I've ripped it off and used it many times, is that we have to be multi-ocular when we're reading scripture. And she didn't use this analogy, but I think of like a spider, right? Because what else is more multi-ocular than a spider? And that our eyes have to be awakened to many different things while we're looking at scripture, in the same way that if I'm watching a Simpsons episode with one of my children, I have to explain to them, why it's funny that, Bart and Homer are in a steelworkers plant and a disco ball comes down, they start playing Everybody Dance Now, and that's hilarious. Like, if you don't know the cultural references, you're not going to get it. And maybe comparing the Simpsons to scripture isn't the best one, but it's hard to understand anything out of context. Even a novel from 30 years ago needs some cultural interpretation. So imagine 2,000 years ago. I think I'm saying something obvious to you that you probably already know, but at the same time, I've sat through and listened to many sermons where I don't think that is obvious. And I do believe, as a clergy person, that scripture has a depth of hermeneutics that is speaking to us actively now. But I don't think denying its historical specificity cheapens that in any way. In fact, I think it opens it up newly and much more radically. And that's what really excites me about preaching and reading and teaching the Bible, particularly in the political aspects of the first century, which is the one thing that we really suppress a lot. And I think that is, in fact, one of the biggest divisions between Christians on the left and right political spectra in the United States are about is, do we read this politically or not, or apolitically? So yeah, the historical Christ, asking who Jesus really was, and the question he commonly asked people was, "Who do you say that I am?" Who was he? And I think there's a difference between speaking of Jesus historically and Christ spiritually or theologically. The words Jesus and Christ can coincide in the same idea, but they're not necessarily the same idea. And I think that's an important distinction if we're going to get hard hitting with theology here, which I think you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, there's the historical Jesus, who's a figure, and then there's kind of the theological concept, the Christ. Does that sound
well?
What you're trying to say?
I mean, Jesus was first century, male and fleshed, right? Christhood, logos, is incarnated into that form, but Christ is not just that. Christ is much more than that. and that's right from the Bible. But often people will say, well, we shouldn't have women clergy because Jesus was male, and I heard John Shelby Spong. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
heard him speak once, and someone asked him what his opinion of that. He was in Chicago at something, and someone asked him his opinion, and he said, if I knew the Pope, I think the Pope had made that argument or something. And then the Pope had said that, and that none of the disciples were men, so that none of the priests shouldn't be male, or none of the priests should be female. And Spong said, if I was friends with the Pope, I'd pat him on the back and say, Jack, which of course, because it was John Paul II, Jack, I don't remember Jesus having any Polacks in the Bible either. So, and although I think that's really funny, the point is the Logos is universal, right? It's the way in which people talk about Christ in these kinds of specificities denies the universality of what the very concept is meant to be. And really you have to know some Plato and know some things about the Greek language and what the word logos means and what the baggage is with that word to really understand that. If you just sort of leave it to what we're translating from the King's English out of the Bible, that we're not going to arrive to that. So that's a really good example of why we should be paying attention to the historical context of the Bible, including Jesus as a historical figure. I have met people, including Unitarian clergy, who have told me that they don't think that Jesus even existed, that it was just sort of a made-up person, which I think is sort of the scholarly conclusion for Lao Tzu, right? I don't think too many people today think that Lao Tzu was really a historical figure. Confucius, on the other hand, was, but there's always the possibility that that's true, but we have no reason to really think that's true. There's no evidence to suggest that, but even if it were that it was made up, I'm, at least for me as a clergy person, my faith is not in a modernistic entrenched understanding of history and truth, but in something much greater than this. That the truth of it is much deeper than history. So the historical Jesus is important for understanding the text, but I feel pretty strongly that there needs to be, once we deconstruct something, we need to reconstruct something, which was really very much the intent of postmodernism. But we sort of forget that sort of leaving Jesus as this nice prophet, or the buddy Christ symbol, is I think is a mistake to sort of leave it there.
Yeah. So I mean, that kind of goes in with the post-Christianity, right? I think you've written some books on that, right?
The what Christianity?
Post-Christianity, or what do they call it? The
Post-Christendom?
Post-Christendom? Yeah. About how, like, a lot of the aspects of what we read in the Gospels aren't historical, and maybe the historicity doesn't really matter so much as the theology and the symbolism. Or is that where you go with that, or am I?
Well, let me back up a little bit. So what I mean by when I use the word post-Christendom, what I mean by that is that Christendom and Christianity are not the same. And you're much more of a historian than I am. When what was the year that Constantine converted?
I don't know.
Whatever that year was, that began Christendom. That essentially began Christendom. Christianity became aligned with the state or empire, right? And I believe that we are in a state now where we are no longer living in Christendom, right? That Christianity being aligned with the state or being assumed as part of the empire or part of an assumed part of the public square by default all the time, I think is a thing of the past. And we could debate when that ended. It's sort of an interesting question of when exactly that ended. People can call it secularization or whatever they want to call it. But I think there is a death of Christendom that has occurred, or perhaps is occurring, but is inevitable if it has not completed. And I think that a lot of the ways to understand Christianity in the United States is very much in the lens of the fact that Christendom, people are seeing Christendom as dying or dead, and they want to restore it, right? And we need to turn the clock back a few decades where we can pretend it's not happening or isn't happening, or any kind of new social responsibilities or awakenings of justice that we have to be responsible for, we can ignore. Um, and we need to bring things back, right? And so when I speak of post-Christendom, I'm talking about that process, which I think is a real crisis for a lot of Christians, and it is a crisis. But at the same time, Christianity, if we read it in the Bible in its historical critical context, was never meant to be an empire religion. In fact, it's quite the opposite, right? If anything, it is the exact opposite of that. And I think the Book of Revelation is a really good example if we read it in its critical context as an apocalyptic work of literature. That this is deeply political in terms of understanding the way in which human power, as aligned with political power and empires, is one of the great evils of the world that needs to collapse, and is something that represses and oppresses people. And to believe that, to hold on to the idea that Christianity must be aligned with empire or global power, I think is one of the fundamental mistakes of Christian history, as I understand it. And I think it's a mistake that's coming a little bit to its conclusion in this post-Christendom era. I hope that makes some sense. And
Sure.
in terms of like, I think what you're referring to with the others is that I sort of align myself with a theological school that we often call just radical Christianity, which has a sort of, I could talk at more length of this, but it has sort of a very specific trajectory out of 1960s ways of thinking about Christian theology, and also along with new ways of thinking about God that emerge from Black and Latinx and queer voices that are rethinking God radically in a post-Christendom era. That we must think about God differently after the Holocaust. Richard Rubinstein was the great Jewish theologian who I'm grateful that I met before he died, who sort of invented the whole idea of Holocaust studies, right? And his whole, well, one of his theses was that we can't, Judaism, from his perspective, cannot remain the same. We can't pretend it's not the same. It's different now, and we have to, whatever you land on theologically, we have to think about God and religion differently. And genocide has been with us for ages, and it continues with us. But if we're going to pick a wake-up call, this is the wake-up call. So a lot of what I'm interested in is thinking about God newly in the contemporary time. And one of the misconceptions about that is that it's a kind of liberal Christianity. So a liberalism is much more interested in sort of modernistic sense of truths, or the historical Jesus, for example, or secularizing scripture, or sort of what's the right word? A lower Christology form of Christianity, and I think that's an important part of a process, but I don't think that's the end goal. But in radical Christianity, I'm much more interested in, not so much like trying to find out the historical origins as a religious practice, but finding out how this is really relevant today, and I find it really relevant and applicable, particularly politically today. And I don't know, I would love to know how people understand the world outside of seeing. I mean, the 2016 presidential election, for example. I don't know how political you want to get, but like I saw that before it happened. I told my wife a year before it was that Trump was going to get elected. I knew how this was going to go. So that's my I told you so to my wife. But what we saw there were sort of two in Hillary Clinton representing sort of liberal Christianity, and Trump sort of, whether he's authentic or not about it, I don't know, sort of very much saying we need to turn back the clock a few decades to when Christendom wasn't dead, and I think sort of stumbled upon this idea that this rabidly connected with a lot of conservative evangelicals for these reasons. What we saw on stage were two, what I think are dead end directions that really were going to lead pretty much in the same way. Just one was more patriarchal than the other, and maybe more racially targeting than the other. But they were ideologically not that far off from each other in terms of like what they were trying to do was trying to hold us back from this inevitable end of Christendom, when we need to rethink. I think we need to rethink the role of religion differently in the United States. And I know that's not the topic of your podcast, but I think that this is a doorway into how we rethink it without just sort of dismissing it or going into a full secularism or something like that.
Yeah. And along the lines, how should we rethink religion?
In the United States? Well,
right.
I should have asked you, what state are you broadcasting?
Minnesota.
Minnesota, okay. I can't speak for Minnesota. I can speak about Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, we have a movement, the Dominionist movement, if you're familiar. The new Reformation, Apostolic Reformation, or NAR, just this week had a prayer service in the Harrisburg Capitol. They're making no way, they're not hiding at all that this is here, that this is influencing things. And dominionism is a whole other subject. But I was thrown off of my rocker when I heard the man that would eventually become the gubernatorial nominee that lost last year, Douglas Mastriano, on stage with several state legislators about a year and a half ago, with some representatives from these groups that actively were talking about ending the separation of church and state in Pennsylvania. And maybe I'm just naive to think that this wasn't something I'd hear, but I walked away watching it. I was probably sitting in my office watching it on my computer right here, and said, like, Pennsylvania is the state that invented separation of church and state, right? And here we are hearing, and it was not just we want to end the separation of church and state. It was actually giving an argument. William Penn never wanted this. The separation of church and state is not mentioned anywhere in any actual founding documents. The phrase comes, from some letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote, or something like that. And they were really sort of giving the constitutionalist argument why we shouldn't have a separation of church and state. And I've come to learn, as someone who's become more politically active in Pennsylvania, that this is driving an enormous amount of policy. This is behind so much more than I understood, even down to like educational policy. Um, that in Pennsylvania, this might be true where you're at too. There's a lot of talk about um, putting public money into private Christian schools, right? Um, and at least in Pennsylvania, there's a very specific, that is forbidden very specifically in the state law. But as long as I can remember, and I'm in my 40s, I've been hearing people saying that they're going to we're going to make it that you can take public money to give to private religious schools in Pennsylvania. Um, it's taken me this long to realize everyone that's been saying this for years has got to know that they'd have to change the Pennsylvania Constitution fundamentally to do that. Like, they know they can't do it without doing that, and to do that, they have to end the separation of church and state in Pennsylvania. Like, the private school thing is code for the end of the separation of church and state. That's just an example. So I think that the state needs to reclaim its role with religion as it is in the Constitution, as not setting up a state religion, but also not being against religion, and also sort of saying, we're a pluralistic society. We want to be a tolerant society, and that only happens if we are, in fact, in agreement that we should be pluralistic and that we want to be tolerant. And that sometimes means that if someone at the table doesn't believe that someone else at the table has the legitimate right to be at the table, then they shouldn't be at the table, right? That's the only way this is going to work, and we need to stop this sort of this liberal falsehood that we're going, by excluding the Klansmen from the round table about race, that we're somehow poisoning the possibility of working out a just future, right? And I also think that we need to be more religiously. I believe that the state ought to foster a sense of more religious literacy in its educational systems, because we have a generation of people that are learning American history through their churches, and they're finding out that the religious history of Christianity or religious history of America is a suppressed history, because it sort of is. And part of the rhetorical shift is that churches, I think, are often presenting itself that there's this agenda that's trying to hide the religious origins of America. And they're not entirely wrong about that, but it's for different reasons. And so now there's this distrust of the whole system, and distrust of what the history is, to the point that someone can go on the steps of the Capitol with a gubernatorial candidate and say, William Penn who invented the idea of church and state being separate, never really meant this to be the case. As someone who left a place because his people were persecuted by the state, that he never really meant that the state needed to be separate from the church. Well, that's just patently false. So we now are sort of in an argument about what is legitimate history, and questioning what our history and heritage is a big part of what's on the altar to be slaughtered in a lot of our public discourse about critical race theory and that sort of thing. I know this is probably way off your topic, but
no, yeah, it's good, especially.
I find that the last thing I'll say about it, sorry to interrupt you, is that the traditional academic liberal perspective has been that the secularization thesis is that the more technologically advanced or intelligent, educated people become, the less religious they are. I would say that the radical position is that that's fundamentally false. People are just religious in different ways, and we might not be able to recognize it yet, but I think that's what we're seeing happen.
Yeah. Or you wonder if it's something like a horseshoe, right? Like you become educated, you kind of are further away from religion, but then as you study it, maybe from a higher critical perspective, or you study it as literature, you gain more of an appreciation for it and see how it's maybe not historically true, but it's theologically true, or something along those lines, or it's
Yeah.
just smart ideas. Like it's just
I mean, growing up Methodist, I don't know if every UCC clergy person could tell you this, but I think almost every mainline Protestant clergy person who's gone to a seminary or their church requires seminary can probably tell you that at least more than one person has told them when they left for seminary, don't learn anything. Like, you got to go for 3 years to study, but don't learn anything, right? It's just going to poison you. That there's this fear of actually learning the Bible is going to take you away. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think if we can't trust our own faith enough to give it to children, let them think for themselves, then we shouldn't be passing it along. That's my opinion, and I know that's not everyone's, but and of course there are dangerous ideas that need to be given context to, but often when I lead a Bible presentation liturgy in a church service, and I actually just did this a couple months ago, part of the liturgy I do is just a very simple thing I wrote 15 years ago, and I've rewritten it many times, is when I present a Bible to a child, when they start their confirmation class, an adult reading Bible, not like a child's Bible, say, I'm trusting you with something that is dangerous, right? This book has done a lot of harm to a lot of people and is still being used to harm a lot of people, but I'm giving it to you because I trust that you're going to be able to find a way of undoing that harm with me in the power of these pages as well.
Yeah, that's powerful.
So back to Christian origins.
Yeah.
Sorry to get
That's
you give a preacher a mic and that's what happens.
Yep. Along those lines, you never see pastors preach, well, we know Mark didn't write Mark, right? We just know that. And nobody believes Second Peter was written by Peter, and Paul for sure did not write this epistle. This theology didn't exist at the time. These Greek words didn't exist. Do you know why that is? Why they don't really teach what you learn in seminary from the pulpit?
Well, I think there's an assumption that your audience doesn't want to hear it. And I think one of the most controversial things that I've done as a pastor in my congregation is when I decided to move away from some more traditional preaching methods to, we're going to open the Bible up and we're going to go line by line through the Bible, right? Now, in a lot of evangelical churches, this kind of expository preaching is something you hear, but I wanted to do it in a way that took the historical critical element of this seriously. And I think that's not what people are used to. I probably come off as super academic, so it wasn't. I had to learn to not be the professor while doing this. That preaching is different than teaching, and always getting around to like, so what, and sometimes the so what can be, we're learning the word closely here, and that's part of a spiritual practice of being Christian, and like it doesn't necessarily have to have a purpose other than I'm deepening my faith and my understanding of Scripture. But that's not how everyone sees it. I think there are a lot more. I think in mainline churches you do hear that said. I can't speak for evangelicals because I don't spend a lot of time in evangelical churches to watch what they're preaching much anymore. But I think some of it is that people are not generally familiar enough with the Bible to even know what to do with that information, unless you have a really biblically literate congregation or expectation of that congregation. Um, I do think that some of it has to do with, at least in some mainline churches, there's a sense of, if I follow the lectionary, which is the pattern of readings that are done in most churches on Sundays, it intentionally skips around the difficult parts, right? So it goes through the cycle of the four gospels over the course of 3 years in one way or another, but it really avoids Jesus's pretty harsh condemnation of divorce. That isn't just in passing; it's pretty significant. Um, we avoid that because we don't want to open that up for debate, because we've come to an agreement that divorce is something today that means something a little different than it meant then, and that churches generally aren't opposed to divorce um, in most circumstances. And but so we avoid the topic altogether. I think that's a mistake, because I think if we took it seriously, this could really highlight the plight of women in the first century and the plight of women globally now, and what the justice aspect of this really was. And that Jesus spoke about divorce isn't so much about trying to condemn women as it's trying to condemn the way in which women were being treated, and how family relationships were going in unequitable ways. Or the prohibition about men laying down with other men that Paul puts down. Uh, that's probably talked about in a lot of evangelical churches, but in mainline Protestant churches, you probably don't hear that. It's avoided because we don't want to open that up for debate. It's controversial, but that also gives us the opportunity to talk about, well, the Greek word that's there is very specific, and it refers to something that we know is very specific, that isn't homosexuality as we understand it today. But this opens up an opportunity to talk about exploitation of children, and exploitation of sexual exploitation in general, and about power in sexual terms. That might not be something that most people want to hear from a sermon. So I think a lot of it is what the expectations are of the church going public. But I don't shy away from those things in the pulpit, but that's me. I know a few years ago there was the Methodist schism that is occurring right now, denominations splitting up. I think the final, if I remember and someone else listening to this can correct me, but the final straw of it was a lesbian bishop was elected in the West Coast, and she then preached a sermon on Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, and where I watched the sermon, gave sort of it was good, nothing like exegetically shocking, that Jesus makes a racial slur and he corrects her, and then he blesses her and turns it around, right? Sort of admits he's wrong, I think that's a fantastic story in the Bible. I've preached that many times, but the woman got an enormous number of trouble for preaching this, and and some of it was they were trying to make the issue that not that the woman was gay, but that she preached that Jesus could make a mistake or have a racist bone in his body, and that is at the heart of the historical Jesus question, that if Jesus as an enfleshed, incarnated person existed in a particular time and place, he's got to be a product of a particular time and place. And the fact that this is recorded in the scripture says something about, we're supposed to take something away from this. And I don't know what that is, other than showing that Jesus pretty much says, I made a mistake here. But the fervor became the lesbian bishop preaches that Jesus was a racist, right? And so I think that's the kind of discourse that we're working through publicly on many of these matters, and it's unfortunate. But when that happened, I was talking to a person in my church who's also in seminary, and he said, well, you just preached on the same thing a month ago, and that's just sort of, well, that's what we expect. It's really not that shocking to take the Bible seriously, but if you think about theologically, that is pretty a bold thing to say, I guess. But it comes down to the difference between Jesus and Christ, right? And of course, I love Nikos Kazantzakis' The Last Temptation of Christ. I love the book and the film. And that's the whole. It was, if Jesus was fully man, then what does that really mean? And as you probably know, it was an ancient Christian heresy to deny the humanity of Jesus. But by saying that Jesus couldn't have had a racist bone in his body, that's essentially saying that Jesus wasn't really human. So to your question, why isn't this talked about today? It's because it's tough. It's tough to talk about this, and I've been in situations where I've been afraid of people in the audience, of what they would do, or if I said what needed to be said today, how many people am I never going to see again, and walk with their feet out. And luckily, I've had good leadership in my congregation that supported me. But that's the bottom line. People are going to find what they want to hear on Sunday mornings and put their money in the plate somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah, like the similar the first healing of the first attempt of healing the blind man in Mark, right, where he just doesn't do it. He like fixes his vision so people look like trees walking. If you remember that you never see that preached either, because it kind of shows him as making a mistake, or not, or being a little closer to human than divine, right? And
yeah, and of course, Mark is the gospel of Jesus coming off. I think we often associate Mark as the gospel of Jesus being more human.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm not sure that's a rightfully earned title. But yeah, Mark definitely puts Jesus in a more human terms. Even though there is this emphasis on the miracles, the supernatural miracles happening in Mark. Sort of at a stark contrast with that, but I find that all very fascinating, and the way the Mark ends and all that.
Yeah, we were talking about that before, and that's a topic that I'm interested in. And as you were talking, I was thinking that the whole mystery of who is Jesus in Mark, right? It's not really, you're kind of left to kind of piece it together yourself. And
that's right.
Like, like what is even going on here, right? Like then there's the whole don't tell anybody, like with he heals the leper. Don't tell anybody about this, right? And
Bible scholars call that the Messianic Secret.
Yeah. And there's tons of it, and like, why is he doing this? What's going on? And you wonder if that's not like why we have it end as it does, because you're supposed to think, what's even going on here?
Mm-hmm.
Is that your take, or maybe not quite?
Well, I think it's really insightful to think of Gospels as propaganda literature, right? That it says in one of them that I wrote these things down that you might believe. They're not meant to be historically accurate, right? And if you read Islamic texts, for example, which I take seriously, one of the primary criticisms of Christianity is that, from an Islamic perspective, is that it requires too much work of interpretation between conflicting accounts that are placed forward in the Gospels, and that the Quran is sort of correcting that problem. I think that's sort of missing the point, but Christians didn't learn from that to say, well, that's missing the point. It's just, other than saying you're wrong, Muslims. That's, when you look at the Gospels, and they're in different order, there's different versions. If you have a gospel synopsis, it's really a book which puts all the stories against each other visually. in English or in Greek. It's really interesting to see how those things changed. And it's not to say that there's not truth in it, but it's to say that each one of them is trying to sell the idea of Jesus differently. Propaganda isn't necessarily bad. It's trying to sell you an idea, right? And the idea here is Christ, and each one of them saying it a little differently and has a little bit different tinge to what it is they're trying to say, and might even have a different audience in terms of what they're saying. And scholars are debating like different time era, the different decade makes a difference of what was going on in the world to inform these. And in some cases that makes a big difference. And of course, Mark is generally regarded as the first one or earliest one. I don't think too many scholars disagree with that at all. But a good question is, why does Mark in its original ending end without a resurrection story? And Mark also does not have a Christmas story in it either. A lot of Christians are sort of shocked to realize that, but very clearly it doesn't have either of those things. And sort of the modern liberal Christian approach might be to say, well, maybe the idea of a virgin birth wasn't made up yet, right? And there was a reason why that was made up, and there might have been a rumor that Jesus was born a bastard or something like that, so they had to come up with this other story. We don't know why Mark didn't include it, but if it were a story that was around in the early church, there's a reason why it wasn't included, and that's a question that needs to be understood if we're going to understand what it is Mark is trying to say that decides to leave that out. I think a stronger case of that is with the Gospel of John, which is the most detailed and long-winded of all of them, that spares no expense of space in terms of word count, is intentionally omitting the virgin birth story. And interestingly, Paul doesn't refer to it at all anywhere. So John, whoever wrote John down, or the group of people that wrote John down over time, made a conscious decision to not include this, and that means something, or they didn't find meaning in that story in terms of what the idea was they're trying to sell. With Mark, the resurrection is hinted at the end. It's not exactly absent, but it's hinted at the end, and it ends with the disciples, everyone's afraid, right? Which I think ends like a good Greek tragedy, right? Everybody's afraid at the end, and it sort of leaves off, it sort of stops the story, like where it should go on. And my assumption is the people that were hearing this be read to them in the first century knew there was more to it, but it's abruptly stops. And sometimes I use as a comparison to this is, you've seen the movie The Patriot, right?
Yeah, a long time ago.
Yeah, it sucks.
Yep.
And I saw it in a movie theater in Chicago with some of my friends when I was in seminary, and it was coming up to the big battle scene, the inevitable big battle scene at the end, and it's really long. And right before the big battle scene, the movie screen turns white, and you still hear the music, and then it just goes black, and that was the end. And I looked at my friends. Mel Gibson is a genius, right? Like, we were all waiting for this big battle scene, and it never happened. Well, then the fire alarm went off. That the film projector caught fire, and we all had to leave in this old movie theater in Hyde Park in Chicago. And we went out. They gave us our money back. They gave us free movie tickets, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody wasn't manning the thing. Well, The Patriot was better with it off, right? Instead of having every little neat package tied on it, because I did eventually see it, and there isn't much that it really adds that I didn't know was going to happen, but it ends this. I guess the comparison I'm making here is that the Gospel of Mark ends the story and more or less turns the camera back on the community to say, now, how are you living out the resurrection? There's a rumor that there's a resurrection. How are you living that out, right? If the church is the body of Christ, personified in the world. How are you living that resurrection now? It's not about bodily resurrection or denying it. It's about putting the ecclesiological or anthropological question back on the human listener of what does this mean for you now? And I think that's what's really genius about Mark. And then they tried to write different endings to it, so it didn't end like that. But it's much better. It works much better if it just stops right there, right? Sort of like how I think of the Patriot, that if they just stopped at a half hour early. Maybe I'm losing people on that one, but
no, that's a good point about. I can say the same thing about Steinbeck, Knights of the Round Table, or what was it called? King Arthur. It's basically the Arthurian legend by Steinbeck.
Right.
And it ends with like Guinevere and Lancelot. There's this prophecy that he's going to betray King Arthur, but he says, I'll never do it, right? You can trust me. And then it ends with, so Guinevere is Arthur's wife, right? And it ends with him passionately kissing Guinevere, right? So he just betrayed him. So like you can see the trajectory, all of the other prophecies are going to come true now, right? But they don't say that, right? It kind of ends there.
And that leads you to then ask some questions. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, and I later learned kind of on the same idea as the thing catching fire. He just never finished it. He was gonna write more, but that's just where he left it.
I didn't know that. And so that leads up all sorts of literary questions to ask. And of course, the explanation is that he just didn't finish it. But I think with a religious text that is a gospel or propaganda, the question very much then is, what does this mean for us, right? Or what does this idea that's been put forward to us change about us fundamentally when we are left with the disciples running away afraid, hearing that Jesus might have come back, right? I think that's a really powerful ending, and I think it's really brilliant. I think it's easy to say, well, there's no resurrection story, so the idea of the resurrection wasn't made up yet, which is often how this goes in that conversation. Yeah. If you read it clearly, that's not what's happening. And unless you just go to the last sentence and read it, that's not what's happening. The virgin birth story, you got me on that one. That's just not there. But it's not in the last gospel either, which is a really interesting question. So the question of why it isn't there is probably more interesting than why something might be there. But each one of and the way the virgin birth story is told in Matthew and Luke are a bit different from different perspectives. And I grew up in a sort of conservative tradition that said that the reason why the Christmas stories are different, because children know those stories and ask that question, why the genealogy doesn't line up, right? Mm-hmm. I remember figuring that out as a child, like putting them side by side, and something isn't jiving. Well, the answer is that, Matthew was writing Joseph's story and Luke was writing Mary's story, and they were different genealogies, and one was of Mary and one was of Matthew. And actually, that's probably not a bad explanation, but it was almost as if Matthew and Luke sat down in the same room and said, we're going to plan this out, right? That we're going to tell the story, but with a different genealogy on purpose, so that 2,000 years from now, they'll figure this out. There's something much deeper going on with the inclusions of these. And I think we miss the point when we try to make it work like a neat little package rather than let it be messy. That's Luke, I think, is a very political text in a lot of ways, and I think the way Mary's story plays out is very political. Matthew, on the other hand, is very interested in the legal aspect of it all. And I know Matthew in Greek because I've studied in Greek more than Luke. The contractual language of the way that Joseph is spoke about and connecting his dreams to the Joseph of the Old Testament stories is intentional. It's a different kind of narrative happening. So I love that kind of nerdy stuff about all of this, and of course, with instead of having a birth story in John, there's a creation story in John. John 1 is a creation story,
Mhm.
and that's where, as I said before, like if you don't know a little bit about Plato, you're sort of missing out on what the depth of this really is. And I think it's really powerful the way that it's written. But I was always taught growing up, the word logos or word here is just the Bible. So in the beginning was the
Yeah.
Bible, and the Bible was there, and the Bible we have was faxed down somehow, and we can also, and the truth of the Bible is the same as the truth of Jesus, and we can talk about Jesus as the Word, and we talk about the Bible as the Word too. Which isn't entirely wrong, but that sort of misses the point of it.
Yeah. That's one thing that I've always wondered about. Like, how do you know it's talking about the word in terms of the Bible, or it's the word in terms of just like the written word, or Jesus, right? Is there like, are they intentionally confusing the term,
Here's
or what do you think's going on?
here's my theory. All right. So are you familiar? I always say there's at least 4 creation stories the Bible, right? There's Genesis 1, and then there's the second creation story, which begins at Genesis 2, 4, and following, I
Mhm.
think. And then there's the one in Proverbs, and the number Proverbs 18, is that right? With the Lady Wisdom, right? The ages ago I was set up before the first words were spoken, before God breathed life into the world and established the mountains. I was there. Before the skies were set at their limit, I was there like a master worker, and I was rejoicing daily in his delight, etc., etc. Speaking of Lady Wisdom, or what was known as in the Greek Bible at the time as Sophia, right? Um, well, this it's appeasing this sense that God had this feminine aspect, right? And we know that Judaism in its pre-Christian times had various um, aspects, different times of the femininity of God expressed theologically or liturgically, in various capacities, and that's a whole other conversation. But the feminine aspect of God counterbalances the masculine side of God as that if something is coming out of nothing, something has to give birth to the universe. So there's this midrash, right? This new story, putting a new tinge on the old story of creation, that there's this creative aspect of this feminine aspect of God that is the conduit through which the world is being given birth, that the material reality is brought into existence from nothing. And God is speaking the word, but the Sophia is the power of the word that's bringing it into material reality, right? And then the Platonic understanding of, so that's one hand, and then the Platonic understanding of the word is this, to make a long story short, sort of like the glue that holds existence together in Plato's metaphysics, right? And it's also the thing we can attune our minds to remember our pre-existence, to know the world of the forms, right? That language is how we connect, can connect the material world to the spiritual world. Well, the word is made flesh, and the word was there from the beginning, right? It's sort of bringing these two concepts together, right? The Sophia and the Logos together. Saying you've heard of the Sophia or Lady Wisdom in Proverbs as the conduit through which reality was brought into being. That is the perpetual creative life force of God as it expressed materially. And you've also, so Jews, this story, and Greeks, this story of the word being the perpetual force that holds the universe together and is the ways in which we can understand a conduit between the spiritual and material. Well, the whatever we want to call that has now been made flesh and has dwelled among us, right? And so that's Jesus, right? And even names it as the light, which is right out of Plato, right? That the truth was the light, right? Like the light being seen coming out of the cave, which brings us back to the mystery religions, right? So I think Plato was actually against the mystery religions of his time, that and saw his allegory of the cave as sort of a reversal of that kind of wisdom, that the truth is out there in the world and not in these rituals that are done in caves. You have to get out of the cave, not go back in it or go deeper. John was taking this concept of the Logos and combining it with a Jewish aspect that sort of brings these cultures together. And I think that's really beautiful. And I think that's helpful in terms of understanding what the Gospel of John's trying to do, which is trying to combine these different elements of culture together. And they found something that sort of works. And I think it's really compelling. So that the Word made flesh is Christ, and that the Logos is this perpetual life force that is universal and all around us at all times and continues as the Christhood in all things now. Is any of that connecting at all?
Yeah, no, that's profound.
If that's familiar to you or not.
I'm familiar with Sophia from the Gnostic tradition, right? Like where they talk about her in the Nag Hammadi texts, but I didn't know that Plato had mentioned Sophia.
He didn't in this
Oh.
respect. The Platonic idea is the Logos. So it's connecting the Platonic Logos with the Septuagint Old Testament Sophia and saying they're the same thing.
Although she's not referred to as Sophia in the Old Testament, right?
In the Septuagint, yes. I don't know what the Hebrew is. Right. But the Septuagint was the Bible that the Jews of that time had.
Gotcha. Yeah, so you wonder if, when they're going back into the Old Testament and Isaiah and Proverbs to get the Christophanies, right? Mm-hmm. You wonder if the Gnostics didn't just do the same thing, right? That they're looking through that, they see the bit in Proverbs about Sophia, and they're like, well, yeah, we're going to take that too, right? And that's where they get the, Gnostic elements.
Well, and that's where the study of esotericism is so interesting and important, because we can look at the history of esotericism as sort of this history of people making arcane connections. Arcane connections are what religions have been all about in the Western world, at least for a very long time. And the Jewish commentary tradition is just full of this stuff. And it's fascinating. I'm not saying this to discredit it. It's fascinating. And it's a multi-ocular way of reading Scripture and applying that hermeneutic to the world that's looking for signs and wonders and revelation in things that often don't make sense. So like I saw a commercial the other day when I was watching hockey on TV for the University of Phoenix or one of these online universities, for-profit universities, saying, guy's having coffee and he's saying, I'm thinking about going back to school, honey. And his wife says, that's a great idea. You should go for, I heard that the University of whomever is only $11,000 for a master's degree. And then he goes somewhere and gets a donut and some snacks or something. And they say, that's $11 even. He's like, oh. And then he sees the number 11 somewhere else. He says, oh. He keeps seeing the number 11 as sort of this arcane, esoteric communication to him that, yes, I need to go get a master's degree in something for $11,000 at the University of somewhere, right? That's the same kind of connection, right? right? That I'm taking things out of context that don't belong together, but sort of coincidentally sound close enough or good enough together that I'm making these connections. And
Mhm.
I think the minds of Westerners were much more attuned to this sort of thing because they read scripture often more, and complex texts, and didn't watch television. They were intellectually, if they were reading, they were thinking about these ideas or listening to the stories. Um, and also had a way of having some information literacy to not always believe everything they hear about these things too, um, a little bit differently than us. But if you go into like what went on with QAnon in the United States, it's the same kind of thinking, right? And it's very easy to go down that rabbit hole and start, if you're open to the idea that there's some sort of communication happening that is secret out there, and some of us are initiated into a place where we can understand it, then we understand it. And no one is, everyone might, the world will say we're crazy and it doesn't make any sense. It's not going to, initiatory information is not going to make any sense to an outsider. That's why it's given in arcane terms. You have to experience the initiation to be there. And so we find this community with interpretation to believe that what was the one thing that RFK is really alive, and whatever it is QAnon people were believing to be true. And we've seen this come out in like some of the January 6th evidence that people saw these numbers put out there, that this is the new 1776. And the person that said it might not have understood what that phrase meant, but they got that phrase from somebody else that knew what it meant. And then that became a signal to someone to interpret it in a way that one person might not have intended, but enough people understood to know that this means go raid the Capitol, right? I don't know if I'm making sense, but this kind of thinking this kind of esoteric thinking is all around us, and we all do it on some level. We I met this girl at this grocery store, and then this bird sat on my porch, and I thought I should give her a call, and that was nature telling me that this was how I would marry my wife. The different sort of things align in a way that sort of say this is speaking some reality to me, or is making enough sense to me that I'm going to make these kinds of life decisions based on this information. And for some people, sometimes I'll hear someone tell me as a pastor, I was in a bad car accident yesterday. I'm okay. But, I just felt like God's presence was with me today, and I got through it. And, as a pastor, I affirm that, right? If this brings you closer to faith, if this brings you closer to God, if this makes you a better person, great. But I also acknowledge that the person who died in the car accident didn't die because God wasn't with them, right? We're not going to generate a whole theology of evil based on this interpretation you have, right? And I think most people get that. Right? Or they wouldn't think this way. I think it's just part of. I think we lose sight of the fact that we often do think in these esoteric and arcane terms to make meaning for ourselves. This kind of thinking to read the scripture, it might seem like what's a stretch to say the Sophia and the Logos in Plato, the Sophia and the Septuagint and Logos and Plato are, there's no way that that's what they meant when they put this together. But when you read it like this, it makes total sense. And if you read patristic scholarship on what the meaning of the Logos is, they understood it that way too, because they weren't that far removed from it. So, and it might be that those two things didn't belong together, but somebody made that connection and made it work, right? Tolkien found Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle and applied it to World War II sensibilities and came up with something absolutely brilliant from it. And interesting and complex and nuanced. And you know what I'm saying?
No.
and finding those connections. And if you go back and watch the Ring cycle, which I try to do once a year, every time I see it, I pick something different out from Tolkien I didn't see before, that I should have seen before, that this is where it came from. I know that Tolkien took this from here, but for Tolkien to then take it and make this connection with this other way of thinking, that's the brilliance of human thinking, right? And that's how we learn to think well. I don't know. I'm going off a tangent on that, but
yeah. Well,
I don't want
that's
to criticize this way of thinking too much.
yeah. Well, yeah. I interviewed Mandaean, and he mentioned that when Mandaeans watch Lord of the Rings, they're floored that this is their religious epic. The parallels are striking. Like even the names are similar, and like
Wow.
the whole plot is like the plot is they're coming to get the ring back and bring it back to the world of light, not to destroy it.
Mm-hmm.
But what is I forget which names are similar, but they just
That's really
said
interesting.
it's crazy, right? That they are convinced that Tolkien was familiar with Mandaeism, but you
That's
wonder if it's
awesome.
just, yeah,
Well, and
if
like,
it's not.
did you do an interview on your video series with that?
Yeah,
Yeah, I need to go back and find that because that's awesome. Or like sometimes if I have extra time when I teach world religions in college, I go into Hoa Hao and Cao Dai, which are Vietnamese religions. And is it Hoa Hao? It's been a while since I taught these things. Hoa Hao sees Victor Hugo as a saint, right? And believe that he was, and Louis Pasteur was divinely inspired. Well, how did that happen, right? Now, it happened partially because of colonialism, right, in that region of the world. But why would people subscribe to a religion that says that, right? And it's because people start making these connections and see things that it's hard for us to put in a context to say why in the 1920s someone would follow a thinker that says that Louis Pasteur and Victor Hugo had these religious visions that were specific to us in Vietnam to build this religion around. But yeah, it's and the Quran is full of things like that too. The esotericism of the Quran is a fascinating subject. But yeah, that's we do this all the time, and I guess what I'm saying is it's easy to sort of point out this crazy thinking about it, but the fact is that is in fact how we make meaning, and even if that meaning isn't really there, we find a way to make it have meaning. And reading scripture esoterically in that sense, I think is really helpful. And really, if you read the New Testament really seriously, and I'm sure you know this, and this is true of the Hebrew Bible too, that the intertextuality of the entire thing is just phenomenally interesting and complicated. And you can't just read it one time and take the fullness of that away. That you can't. Like I did a Bible study on the Book of Revelation a year or two ago, and I really did a deep dive in for this time. I taught it, and I never took notice before because I had a commentary I was using this time that was using the description of the Temple of Solomon, the way in which the Temple of Solomon is to be described in the Hebrew Bible, invoked in the Book of Revelation. That brings a lot new meaning into that section of the Book of Revelation that I'd never made a connection of before. I just didn't see it or even think about it. But clearly the person writing this down was making this reference. It's not a mistake. But the fact that somebody made this reference in the first place, is brilliant. And I'm sure there's many people that have read the Book of Revelation and never seen that too, because I wouldn't if I hadn't read that commentary. So yeah, it's I guess we're talking about it. Sometimes the crazy thinking is what you need to do to make sense of these texts, and especially when you get into things like mystery cults and Gnosticism. There's a lot of those kinds of connections that are being made in those texts, and I'm not an expert on a lot of that, but the fact that somebody said that, I forget who said it, that Christianity was just ripping off Mithraism.
A lot of people said that.
A lot of people said that.
There's the documentary Zeitgeist. Is that where you've heard that?
I'm not sure I'm familiar with that, but
yeah.
I don't know if it was Josephus. I don't know who said that. There's somebody early on that made that claim about Christianity and Mithraism. And I think the way in which Christianity sort of went later, there is some connection there, but just the fact that they met in secret, right, and had secret rituals isn't enough to say that that's really what the connection with Mithraism is. But if somebody used that as the benchmark from which they launched ways of thinking about Christianity to try to make these connections, then it might make more sense, or it might be constructed in a way that makes sense. It's enormously playful to have to go down these scholarly trails, and the fact is we often just don't know, and we might not ever know what the answers are.
Yeah, with the whole Mithraism thing, it's incredibly interesting that we have a lot of things are just plain off. Like there's no reason to think Mithras was born on December 25th. You've probably heard that, right? He's not born of a virgin. He's born of a rock. Maybe he dies and ascends, but we'd have to read really far into it to get there, right? But there are interesting parallels. Like they were both big in Tarsus. That's where Paul is from. Maybe he's connecting a few dots, right? And armor, it was a like a military thing with the Roman army, right? And we think that that's maybe where the armor of God comes from when Paul is discussing that in Ephesians. And instead of the crucifix, which comes much later, but they have the trochthony, the bull being stabbed in the front of the thing, which that's an interesting parallel. That has to be coincidence. Maybe they all are, right? But it's crazy with connecting those dots.
Yeah, I guess I mentioned Mithra because I think there is a lot of scholarship that's sort of trying to connect the two, and clearly people in the ancient world made that connection, but it's not clear why. And even what knowledge we have of Mithraism, we have a lot of question marks, right?
Yeah.
But we do know that Mithraism was much more common than once thought, and the extent of Mithraism's influence in the Roman military, I think, is another topic of scholarship, and this is outside of my field. But it seems like, from me, in my opinion, that seems like a lot of coincidence. I think it's worthy of exploring. It's worthy of unpacking. I think that Paul comes from Tarsus is really relevant to this. But to me, that seems like a lot. I think it's a lot of coincidence, but that doesn't mean I don't think it's valid thing to explore. And it might be that you're right. I think the reason why I'm a little resistant to Mithraism is based on what I understand of Mithraism is that its sense of power and force in its theology, as a central element, is huge, right? That's what's the creation narrative that is shown in the typical image of Mithra mounting the bull, and the snake is chomping at the side, and I'd love to point out to my students when I show a picture of Mithra that there's a scorpion eating the testes, right? They really didn't like the bull, right? There's probably some precedent in early Zoroastrianism that this is connecting to also, that I think has legitimacy to explore. But the central idea of Christianity as an anti-empire religion, a religion that eschews power as its primary understanding of faith, right? That Paul speaks of the weakness of God, that it's the image of Mithra might actually be more of an opposing, a sense of something we're standing in opposition to, right? And so when Paul is making that connection with the breastplate, I never heard about Mithra and the armor of God as the comparison. I have to think about that some more, but that's interesting. But I always thought of it as the just simple Roman soldier. But the Roman soldier is the symbol of power that's sort of being inversed here, right? As a power of defense rather than offense. And I think that if it was Mithra, I think I'd say the same thing. That's what Paul is. I don't think the meaning would change. And it may be that Paul is invoking, and maybe Paul's invoking both at the same time, thinking that's. Or that he makes this connection because of his cultural context that had Mithra as part of its culture, you know. So I think that's all legitimate discourse. I mean, I took a class in Zoroastrianism at the University of Chicago. I ended up auditing it because they were all PhD students. I was a master's student, and I was in a very different academic place than those other students. I could not keep up with the class. And so I just audited it. And there was a lot of talk about Mithra, the ascent of Mithra out of Zoroastrianism as this figure in Zoroastrianism. They don't really have much of an explanation for where it came from. And then sort of how did Mithra become this other religion? And it might just be coincidental, but it's too uncoincidental to be coincidental. And there's a whole theory built around the symbolism of the bull, with the theory, I'm thinking back long ago here, the theory about how the civilization that eventually that populated the Indus Valley sort of separated cultures long ago and took opposing symbols of the bull or of the bovine animal with them, so that in the religions that emerged in the Indus Valley, the cow would become sacred, whereas in the religions that went this way, there would be this tradition of the bull being the symbol of the weak. Although that's not what Mithraism ultimately made the bull as, but it became the symbol of weakness, and that's found in some of the really old Zoroastrian texts, like the Gathic Avestas, where the whole earth sings the praises of Zoroaster as the prophet, but the cows say Zoroaster might be good enough for humans, but he's not good enough for the cows, sort of thing. So,
yeah, I think that's what was his name? Coumont. He's French, I think. Coumont. That he's the guy who came up with the Indus Valley thing, and there's the whole, they have motifs about scorpions and they have motifs about bulls and whatnot. Although
that could be coincidence too.
What's that?
That could be coincidence too.
Yeah. I think the only thing that, well, okay, maybe not the only thing, but the biggest thing that they have in common is really only the name, Mithra and Mithras. And that's really kind of the only thing that they have in common. But they also have light and dark, the duality. Right. They have the good guy and the bad guy. That's Zoroastrian as well. But it's like a star chart, right? So you see Taurus. Up above that is Perseus, then there's Scorpio, and you can kind of see them all in the sky. And that's how they kind of came up with that picture. So it's pretty neat.
What we need is to bring back philology as a discipline for these kinds of things. Again, I'm speaking out of turn of some of the stuff that you know better than I do, but um, the idea, how the morphology of ideas through history and how they connect. And some are coincidental and some are not. And rethinking some accepted narratives of that. I mean, you said I'm not familiar with Kumant, but there may be good reason to question these kinds of sort of neat package ways of thinking about East and West. I know some of that had, if I remember, something of that had to do with the language too. The forms of the language was part of the analysis. And I can't speak to that, but I know when I took this class, the rule was if you had passed your Greek exam and your Sanskrit exam at the University of Chicago, you could stay for an extra hour and the professor would teach you Gathic Avestan language. And I tried to sit through that, having done Greek, and I was completely lost. But the idea is that this language is sort of seen as the closest thing they have to the touchstone between these cultures. That I think the grammar, I guess, is very, very similar in one direction, and the words are very similar in the other direction. I don't know, but I know that the language is part of that argument.
Yeah, for sure.
So I hope I went all over the place here today, and
no, it's good. I enjoyed it.
When you initially contacted me, I thought, I hope you know I'm not a scholar of history, but I definitely have an opinion about things today. But I'm glad that people are looking into these sorts of things, and I'm glad to be part of the conversation because I think it is important. And even if I think it's the wrong direction for some of this, like I said, I really applaud people that think in these directions because that's how we make discoveries. And I was just having a conversation with a young pastor who asked me about something I wrote on Bonhoeffer, if you're familiar, and that there's this new trend of questioning whether Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian, was gay. Now, I know enough about Bonhoeffer that I don't think he was gay. And I don't think it really matters, really, in terms of my opinion of Bonhoeffer. But I think it's definitely a valid question to ask, right? There isn't an invalid question to ask here, right? And it might be that we find something really interesting. It might be that we discover that he was, and that might open up some new things. But even if I think something is definitely a wrong direction, and I do think that's not going to yield much, but it doesn't mean it's not a wrong way of thinking or it's illegitimate way of doing academic work.
Yeah, for sure. All right. And then anything else you wanted to say, or any thoughts, or maybe we'll just leave it there?
Yeah, well, thanks for your time. And you can look my books up on Amazon if you want. And you might not know this, I create a series of coloring books based on radical Christian interpretations of Scripture. They're probably the only coloring books that ever have footnotes in them. And they were published by Chalice Press, and I'm very proud of those. That they came out great.
Yeah, I remember when I was Googling you, I saw those. Yeah, they're very good.
And the one I did with an artist called Coloring Women of the Bible, I think is one of the best things I ever did. And this might be of interest to your listeners, that we tried to take female characters from the Bible, many of which are not known very well, and sort of stuck to the more obscure ones, really, and then took all the feminine images of God from the Bible and put them together into a sequence of images to color. And I'm really proud of how it came out. The Chalice Press was great to work with. The only thing, they made the artist take the nipple off of a character once, and so I was when I've taught it with groups, like small groups, I've always said a good theological question for you to answer for yourself is whether you draw the nipple back in or not, because they're adult coloring books. But yeah, and they're highly academic apparatus at the end with the footnotes. So I don't think anyone has ever done anything like it, and I'm really proud of it. So thanks for letting me push that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much. It was fun and interesting.
Thank you.
And yeah, I really enjoyed it. All right. And yeah, and everybody, thanks for watching, and have a great rest of the day here.